Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. We hope that everyone is safe and sound at home. The title of our webinar today is Achieving Growth and Sustainability in Current Economic Conditions. Now, some of the methodologies you're going to see in this presentation, you may have seen in some way, shape, or form. They're widely used across organizations in the world. So we just wanted to give you sort of an idea of what you could do with this downtime and the sort of free time that we all have given the pandemic. So where are we today? And we're not going to dive into COVID-19 and everything that has been going on, but just to give a little bit of a preface to what we want to talk about. You know, this worldwide pandemic, this COVID-19 has affected businesses from small to large. And these organizations are starting to face challenges from multiple directions, and they're new challenges, right? There's something that we can't really control. And that pandemic is really dictating how businesses are performing in the short term. But we at Siuma really believe that while it is sort of dictating how we perform in the short term, in the long term, it's up to those business owners, those leaders and employees to sort of shape and determine how the business is going to perform in the long term, right? We're starting to see organizations sort of reinventing themselves and, trying to find for new avenues for growth and profitability. We believe that one of those ways to do it is by increasing the visibility, transparency, and ownership into the organization through sort of a zero-based cost leadership approach. Now, sort of before we dive into the methodology, just a little bit of a background on how we kind of get to sort of this quote-unquote recommendation. As I imagine most of you on this call have experienced some sort of turmoil in your organization, whether it's large or small, as a result of the pandemic. You can probably relate to this depiction. So on the left of the graph, we have a spectrum of sort of profits and losses over a period of time. So where are we today? That shaded area is, hopefully it's more towards the left than it is to the center. But these current economic conditions have sort of forced numerous companies into a standstill, right? And it has reduced revenues significantly. Yet as those revenues have decreased, costs have either remained fixed or in some cases have increased, as we've seen in some companies either paying early retirement or having to furlough workers. So the key takeaway here is that depth and that breadth of losses really depends on how quickly the company can react to identify, quantify, and target any cost savings opportunities. So where do we want to be? Where we want to be is obviously where our revenues are greater than our costs. But in order to get there in this downtime, we must examine our cost structure and sort of try to implement one or all of the approaches to sort of a zero-based cost leadership methodology so that the organization can kind of pivot and create that durable, resilient growth for the years to come. Now, that breadth of cost savings really varies greatly from company to company. Some are more well-equipped than others, and sort of depends how successful the cost leadership initiatives are, but it kind of gives you an idea of where you could go. So if we were to summarize this graph in one way, this green part, let's just call it profitability. And profitability distinctly affects how businesses perform in the market. So if we look at competitive agility, and this is sort of used widely across the US and Fortune 500 companies, it can be sort of segmented into three components: your customers and your growth, your profitability, and your sustainability. Now, all of these are important, right? And we mustn't ignore one or the other. The purpose of this webinar is directly linked to profitability because given the economic downturn, we believe that it carries a significant weight with competitive agility. So take, for example, your organization. What factors affect its profitability? You could argue it's its revenue, you could argue it's your costs, or maybe even a mix of both. And in our experience, it's usually a mix of both, where you're looking to sort of increase your revenues while trying to optimize your costs. So if you look at your costs, you can dissect profitability into three main components. You're going to look at your spend, which is, how much of my spend, meaning your selling, general, and administrative expenses, is aligned to your growth objectives. Then you can look at your organization. How do you design that organization for what it needs tomorrow, rather than modify what it is today. And third, you can look at your supply chain. And of course, supply chain is more applicable for companies in industrial, mining, manufacturing, like, for example, many service companies such as accounting firms, lawyer firms, and even consulting firms don't really have cost of goods sold. But when you look at supply chain, it's how can you optimize those cost of goods sold to reduce complexity in the business? So those three would cover the cost component of profitability. But now let's look at the revenue side. If we look at ways to increase revenue, we kind of want to look at your front office functions. And by front office, we don't mean, CFOs, COOs, CEOs. We mean more like, how can you fully optimize your pricing to maximize your revenue? Now, not every organization is going to have each of these components as an opportunity, but these four areas sort of build that foundation to establish a zero-based approach in the organization. So you may be asking yourself, how can we do this? And yes, it's easier said than done. Typically could require a 4-person team, maybe even 10, 15, 20-person team, and 3 to 6 or maybe even 12 months to fully implement, of course, depending on the size of the organization. But sort of this downtime can kind of give you a head start. So now before we dive into the methodology, we believe it's really important to make a distinction. We're not talking about a traditional cost reduction, if you will. Cost reduction, let's kind of go out with the old. Cost reductions are sort of one time. I guess we've all kind of heard it in the organization where, guys, we're going to cut marketing by 10%, or we're going to cut our IT spend by 10%. Cost reductions are only focused on one area. They provide little visibility into the organization. And most importantly, a cost reduction is typically thought of as negative for the organization. At least in our experience, when we've heard cost reduction, it typically means, how do I, get rid of the most people I want? And that's not what we're suggesting. Let's go in with the new. Let's look at this zero-based cost leadership approach that's been used, across multiple industries and different sectors. Cost leadership focuses on that durable, continuous improvement. It doesn't just focus on one area, it's sort of cross-functional and regional. So it increases visibility into the organization. And now the most important part, instead of it being negative, or at least being regarded as negative, it's positive. It's needed for growth and it's beneficial for trust in the organization. This sort of in the new means more sustainable businesses, right? Because you're going to sort of improve your cost position. You're going to identify those opportunities at intersections of your business, and you're going to push that cost leadership, always thinking through that innovation lens. How can I be better tomorrow than I was today? So now you've sort of heard me mention the zero-based approach multiple times, so we kind of want to get right into it. A zero-based approach focuses on identifying strategic investments and those improvement initiatives to strengthen any function in your organization. So I kind of want to do a little exercise here. Say the organization in question is, provides call center services for institutional clients. As we've kind of all seen, as artificial intelligence, maybe smart bots or smart chats become more popular, that organization might be thinking, okay, how can I shift my current structure to become more agile and more sort of technology friendly? So you can take a look at your technology spend. First, you're going to look at your current state of that specific business area. How much are you spending? How many FTEs you have, which stands for full-time employees, and how much workload that area has. Once you have that, you sort of determine what the minimum amount of spend you need to support those business critical activities to sort of operate and distribute, whether it's a product or a service. From there, you're going to add on, if needed, investments required based on the strategy of the organization. In our example, if the strategy of the company is sort of to become more technology forward, the company might need to invest quite a bit to automate, whether it's partially or fully, the services that it provides. From there, you're going to reach your revised cost base, which is a sum of your minimum spend plus the investments required based on your strategy. Now, once you've reached that revised cost base, let's take a look at some cost reduction initiatives that will sort of free up that capital that'll help you arrive to your future state goal. Now, the gap between 1, that current state, and 6, which is the future state goal, are those estimated cost savings that could provide that net income uplift or unlock your funds for future investments. Of course, this is an illustrative example and by no means guaranteed, just to give you an idea of how this zero-based approach works. Now, while this example may seem like a one-time activity, it's far from that. So let's dive into a little bit of the methodology. The zero-based methodology is sort of based on a closed loop approach to cost reduction, which gives organizations the ability to identify, target, and execute those cost leadership initiatives with sustainable results, and typically requires sort of 6 steps. First step is visibility, which could take about 2 months depending on the size of the organization, but its main goal is to provide transparency to the true cost and efficiency of the operations through financial and operational data. In other words, you're going to see sort of who spends how much and on what. And by who, we don't necessarily mean a specific person. We look more at like categories in business areas. Second step is value targeting, which could take 1 to 2 months. And that goal is to sort of identify and quantify those initiatives to improve your cost position. Third, once you have those initiatives, you have to assign them. You're going to assign ownership to each cost category just to make sure you got accountability across the organization and no stone is left unturned. From there, you're going to go into your zero-based design, which is sort of creating that bottom-up budget by business function. And then let's get to work. Let's execute those initiatives. Let's deliver the identified commitments through those category owners. And last step would be our controlling and monitoring, where the company can sort of set up and execute processes and tools for that monthly review to identify any variances and develop an action plan if there's a gap. Now, as you can see, steps 4, 5, and 6 are in a constant loop. And number 4 should be done every year, to ensure that the organization is truly being meticulous and aware of the cost that it has. So now that we've sort of covered the methodology, we're going to give a brief overview of the 4 categories of profitability we mentioned before and how they sort of apply to this approach. So let's get started with zero-based spend. Zero-based spend looks at really like overhead, non-people costs, your selling, general, and administrative expenses. So take, for example, your organization. On your left, you're going to have your entire selling, general, and administrative expenses. This is going to exclude your compensation and benefits. Why? Because that's covered under the organization component of profitability. So what you first have to do is sort of categorize your spend into sometimes as many as 4 layers just to make sure that you cover all your bases. So let's say this business in question is a smart warehousing company. You could categorize its SG&A into the following categories. Facilities, which ones are using for their warehousing? The technology they're using, are they using fingerprint readers? Are they using some sort of a different technology that allows people to sort of dock their materials and the things that they've sort of have in these warehouses differently? Then we can look at our financial services. How much am I spending on my audit, for example? Maybe any events and sponsorships. If the organization is, kind of up and coming, did it have to spend a little bit on events to make sure that, the word kind of got out there? And maybe lastly, we know that people are the most important part of an organization. Did it spend anything in people development? Of course, this is a non-exhaustive list. We could go on and on sort of categorizing a business just to give you an idea of how it could be looked at in a zero-based spend. So now that you're able to categorize your spend to a sort of a significant level of detail, you then begin to ask yourself, how can I optimize this spend? So there's 4 levers that you can take a look at in order to sort of unlock savings in SG&A. You can look at your consumption, how much are you actually consuming of a good or service? Is it too much? Is it too little? So that could be modified by policies in the organization. You can look at price. What price are you actually paying for that good or service? Is it the right one? Could you get a better price? And that can be modified through maybe a vendor consolidation or a rate negotiation. Specification. It's sort of what requirements do I need for each good and service? Am I buying the right ones? Do they make sense for my business? And that can be modified sort of by like standardizing services across the organization for non-business goods. And lastly, I think a fairly important one in the last years is digital. Now, how can I adopt technology? Can that technology sort of reduce or eliminate my costs? Can it make things easier for me? So of course, every category will have a lever or multiple levers that it can pull, and not all of them apply to each category. But once you've sort of determined which lever or levers you can sort of pull, You can then estimate the likelihood and range savings in a category based on internal and external benchmarking. So let's take a little quick step back to the example that we had, where we had sort of 5 categories in our SG&A. And we look at our facilities spend. If we look at it on a sort of a continuum between, your first quartile, which is where you want to be, and your third quartile, you plot yourself. You say, okay, let's say this dot represents the current spend of the company, whereas the star sort of represents the average for your industry. From there, you can sort of estimate which of those levers you're going to pull can get you to that ideal state and sort of the probability of reaching it. That is going to translate into a range of sort of low to high savings. The same can be done for other categories, and it may happen that the jump isn't as large, or that your company is close to the industry average. And maybe your company is even a leader amongst its peers. But nonetheless, we should always strive to move towards that first quartile, of course, without sacrificing efficiency and productivity in the organization, but always try to be better tomorrow than we were today. So once we have those sort of savings ranges, we can sort of add them up and redirect that spend to support those strategic initiatives and take that to the bottom line. You could call it like non-productive SG&A spend, and make sure that it goes towards where it has to be, where it adds value into the organization. So now that we've covered spend, we're going to look at our second component of profitability, which is organization. So in the zero-based organization, we focus on that work that sort of drives that value to the organization. And there's a couple questions you can ask yourself that revolve around sort of 5 themes. So the first one is my organization focused on the right work? What am I doing today, and what should I be doing tomorrow? Can I reduce the complexity in our business model and policies? Second, is my organization the right size? We've all seen it where maybe you're kind of a startup, kind of getting forward, and sort of the company begins to grow. And is the company really the right size for what you're doing and the sort of product or service that you're delivering? What is your mix of employees versus part-time labor? Third, what's the right structure? In the previous example, as the company grows, maybe that structure can get kind of blurred out. So are there any design principles that you can embed into the organization to make sure that you're working on the correct things and that you're adding value to the organization? Now, the fourth question, probably one of the most important ones, because people are the most important piece of an organization. You ask yourself, do I have the right people? What skills do I need in the future? Is there any, skills gap between what I have now and what I'm going to need tomorrow? And all of these organizational changes that you might make, what is going to be that impact on people, right? We're not robots, we're humans. How do I navigate and modify the organization so that it makes sense? And lastly, do you measure yourself correctly? Are you really distributing accountability correctly? Is there an appropriate governance structure that you can fit in that makes sense for the size of the business, for the industry that it's in, and for the structure that it has? So these are just some questions. We could go through a whole list of them, but they all sort of revolve around these 5 principles of a successful and efficient organization. So this sort of covers the zero-based organization part, and now we've covered the first 2 components of profitability. We're going to move now towards supply chain. Now, as mentioned before, not every company has cost of goods sold, so this may not be applicable to your organization, but for completeness sake and the listeners that we have on the line, we thought it'd be best to include it. The zero-based supply chain really targets your cost of goods sold, and it sort of drives improvement across the end-to-end supply chain. So let's take a look at an example of an alcoholic beverage producer, and let's look at its really, really simplified supply chain, by no means accurate or to scale. But let's go and see, for example, our first step is our raw materials. Sort of, how do I source? How do I procure those materials that allow me to build my product? So in our example, if the company produces whiskey, where is it procuring and sourcing its rye or its barley from? Can it probably switch to suppliers that provides multiple of those to probably get a better price? In this specific component, we can find an optimized cost through the direct materials that we buy, or maybe through vendor consolidation. Second step in the supply chain would be our manufacturing, right? So in other words, how are you making your product? The company could look at its manufacturing labor, its energy and utilities. Is it really efficient? Do I have sort of an old factory that's allowing me to manufacture my product? We could even look at its packaging. The third step would be its warehousing. In other words, how am I storing my product? Here you could look at your warehousing labor. Maybe the facility location isn't optimal. Maybe it was optimal, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, but as the market changed and as the country sort of changed and evolved, does it still really make sense for you? Or you can look at your fixed warehousing costs, maybe security or any maintenance work that you have to have in the warehouse. Fourth, you can look at your transportation. In other words, how are you moving your product? Does the company have its own fleet? Does it use a 3PL provider? How much is the company spending on outbound logistics? These are some of the questions you can ask yourself to make sure that you're truly being efficient and optimal with the resources you have. And lastly, just for completeness sake, in this sort of supply chain, we would have your end consumer. Sort of how are you planning on selling your product? Now, we're not going to talk about this now. It's sort of targeted through front office functions, which we're going to cover later on. So to find savings in this component of profitability, we can look at price, the same as we did with spend. How much are you paying for those goods? You can look at performance. How profitable are each of these goods? And then we look at something that can be called sort of value engineering. Can I get more value out of the goods that I'm sort of purchasing? Is there a way that I can do more with less? So with this of a zero-based supply chain, we've sort of covered the cost component of profitability. We're going to move towards our fourth and final component of profitability, which is our front office functions. Now, a zero-based front office approach examines value levers across sort of 3 categories. So let's take a step back to our supply chain example, in which sort of the end of that supply chain was the end consumer. And to sort of not just look at costs like we did with other components, you're also kind of going to look at revenues. It's how do we maximize our revenues with our end consumer? And like I mentioned, we can do it in 3 ways. First, we can look at our sales. For example, can we decrease our direct selling costs? Or can we improve our sales force effectiveness? You can also try to hopefully acquire new customers or improve your product or service value. For marketing, you can decrease your customer and market research costs, and you can try to maximize those marketing returns from your owned media, which is your website and social media accounts. And third, we can look at our service. Can we improve our back office efficiency? Can we decrease our customer churn? Or can we increase our sales conversion? Now, a strict component that could sort of affect all of these is pricing, right? So how can you improve your margin efficiency or sort of try to maximize that customer lifetime value, which is how much a customer spends on your products or services over a period of time. And that period of time is typically how long the customer remains indeed your customer. So now these are just some example, and of course not applicable to every company, but the ultimate goal of the zero-based front office is to reduce operational costs and increase your revenue. So with this, we sort of cover the 4 components of profitability and how they sort of apply at a high level to the sort of the zero-based cost leadership approach. You may be asking yourself, right, all of this sounds great and doable, but how do you make it stick? And of course, there isn't a correct answer. We believe that, without organizational culture changes, these changes won't stick. If we don't have leaders, if we don't have owners and employees that are willing and committing to making this change, none of this is going to work. So what is organizational culture? Now, every organization has a system of values, which those are the things that we believe are the most important to us. And we also have, mindsets, which is sort of assumptions we hold about the way the world is. And those 2 are sort of visible through the way people behave, those outward signs of culture. And together, these form an organizational culture, and it's sort of the sum of how people believe, assume, and act. Now, why is organizational culture so important? Well, each organization, I'm assuming if you're a leader or an owner, you can definitely relate to this. Every organization has a vision and a purpose. It has that strategic intent. There's this really great book by Simon Sinek that's called Start With Why. And we always hear companies say, you know, what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. But Simon sort of mentions that we kind of have to do things the other way around. Why do we do things? And then we do what we do and how we do it. So this organization is going to have a vision and a purpose, and it's going to have a strategic intent. But that culture, you know, those system of sort of shared mindsets and values that are visible through how we behave is going to allow us to reach those business outcomes that the organization wants. Now, it doesn't have to be all of these. It doesn't have to be any of these, but it could be profits. It could be greater revenue growth. It could even be greater customer satisfaction. Culture is so important because it directly affects how people sort of perceive and deliver the organization's strategy. And now, while you may be thinking that culture is hard to change in an organization, it is. You know, we aren't saying that it isn't. We believe that sort of culture can be shifted and made tangible across the organization. If we see others putting behaviors into action, and we believe that those behaviors are sort of the way that we do things around here, and then we do activities that sort of practice using those behaviors daily, and then we repeat and reinforce these three every single day, you're going to be able to make that culture shift in the organization tangible, and it's going to be able to sort of stick. So sort of to summarize, the key drivers to actually successfully implementing this can be sort of condensed into three. The first one is you need activating leaders. You need those people that are sort of going to carry the baton and going to make sure that this is where we're going, and I'm going to help you get there. From there, those sort of activating leaders are going to shift sort of mindsets and behaviors in the organization, and they're going to push forward some change. And once sort of that shift in mindsets and behavior has sort of happened, or is at least beginning to happen, you can hardwire those behaviors into the organization. So in order for this to actually work, you have to instill a radically different value system with employee behaviors that sort of reward ownership and accountability. Because if not, I think we're all going to sort of fall short of any type of initiative. So now that we've covered the four components and how they, I guess, briefly an overview apply to a zero-based cost leadership approach, you're probably asking yourself, okay, so what do I do next? All of this sounds great. What can I do next? So as I mentioned before, yeah, COVID-19 has sort of turned that business environment head over heels. And given this quote unquote downtime we may have as an organization, whether large or small, now might be a good time to begin a sort of a quick scan of your cost structures. You don't have to boil the ocean and do everything at once. Probably just look at spend and look at one category and slowly begin to understand and unlock those areas of improvement for your business. Because tomorrow you're going to have to reinvent yourself. You're going to have to look for new avenues for growth, profitability, and sustainability. And that quick scan that you did today when you had that downtime is going to provide greater visibility to the organization and sort of it's going to give you a path to fuel that growth and sustainability. It's going to be able to sort of support your strategic objectives. So with this, this would kind of conclude our webinar. We want to really thank each and every one of you for being with us today. Hopefully, all of it, or at least some of the information was useful and productive for your organization. If you would like a condensed copy of this presentation, we do have one. So please feel free to reach out to us via email and we will gladly forward you one. We want to thank you again, everyone, for your time. Let's stay safe, and together we will, be able to beat this pandemic and look for new avenues of growth.